Welcome, viewers, and to those of you joining us through the various platforms this discussion is on. My name is Mina Al-Arabi, and I am the editor of The National, and I am based here in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. Delighted that for our conversation entitled Peace as a Paradigm Shift, a New Era of UAE-Israeli Cooperation, I have with me His Excellency Omar Saif Gabash, Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for Cultural Affairs from the UAE. However, His Excellency is in Washington as we speak, and in true COVID-19 era fashion, we are doing this socially distanced, but very much connected. Your Excellency, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mina.
I'm delighted you had time to do this. I know it's been a very busy schedule as you arrived in Washington, D.C. Yesterday on Sunday, and will be there for the historic signing tomorrow of the peace treaty between the UAE and Israel. The Abraham Accords were announced in August and really were quite a historic moment for the UAE, for Israel, for the United States, and for the region. 2020 for many people will be marked by COVID-19 and all the implications it's had. Unfortunately, for too many people, it will mean a somber moment due to either ill health, losing loved ones, losing jobs, losing livelihoods. But in the UAE, we've had a different kind of year. We've had an exciting launch of the Hope Mars probe. We've had the start of the first nuclear power station in the Arab world, Baraka. And of course, we've now had a peace treaty being signed tomorrow and peace accords announced between the UAE and Israel. So here to discuss with us, His Excellency Omar Gabash will tell us what this means for the UAE and for the region. Please tell us your views before I start into my many questions for you.
Great. Well, on a personal note, it's a tremendous a moment. I'm really personally honored to have been invited by Sheikh Abdullah to attend the signing of the accord. It's something that I've always looked forward to, and perhaps like many Emiratis and many Gulf Arabs, this is something that I've always wondered about, but never really been able to speak about. So it feels like a huge taboo has been removed from the way in which we can look at the Arab world, at ourselves as well. And I think one of the interesting things is the number of young Emiratis in particular who have spoken to me or let me know how excited they are, how interested they are in Israel, how they want to learn about the people and the language and how they want to travel there. So it's just, from a kind of a sociological perspective, it's interesting to see how these taboos have operated in our lives and how easily that they've been removed and we see what happens next.
So I wanted to ask you, do you take this as a significant change, a marked change for the UAE, or is it a natural next step?
I think the decision in itself is a marked change because it sent a very powerful signal to the region and, further afield that we are a state that respects its own decision-making, that respects its own interests, or respects its own sovereignty, and is very, very aware of its sovereignty. And that, for possibly one of the first times in our part of the world, we have a state that is actually saying, look, I have Arab loyalties, I have Islamic loyalties, but I also have my own interests and the interests of my population and the interests of my statehood. And what we're doing is we're putting our sovereignty, our interests first, in a way that has surprised many of our partners in the region and some of our enemies in the region as well. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking back decision-making into our own hands, where in the past we will have outsourced any relationship with the Israelis to the Palestinians and to the so-called frontline states. I think this is, in itself, it's a very powerful decision. Sovereignty, of self-interest, of a desire to solidify kind of the base of the state, but at the same time, it's a reflection of a long-term change that was taking place not just in the Emirates but across the Gulf states. We've moved from being populations that were poorly educated to being populations that are highly educated. Now, that in itself doesn't mean that you have to go and make peace with Israel, but it does mean that we will now look at regional issues in a different light. no longer driven by ideology, no longer driven solely by political considerations. We also are driven by economic imperatives. We're driven by cultural and social imperatives as well. And we have a recognition of our demographics as well, where we have young populations that have aspirations. Now, my generation was a population whose aspirations were not really central. There was state building, there was sort of basic economic development. But now we have kids who have a desire to live a life, and a complex life. We have complex economy, we have niches, we have all kinds of things going on. And that creates a different kind of impetus. It means that we need to be connecting in a global economy with global players. We can't be a global player as we wish if we don't connect with other global hubs. And Israel is, without doubt, one of those hubs, a technological hub and a political hub. And it's for those reasons, I think, that what we've done is both natural and shocking as well.
You mentioned the word taboo, and I think that's really quite interesting because in societies all over the world, there are certain issues that are seen as taboo, that you can't broach them. And I do believe that discussing issues to do with Israel, to do with, what does peace look like and so forth, was often seen as taboo. And so, but very quickly, we've seen a step change in how people reference relations with Israel. So do you think that that's because that's, as you said, people used to talk about this behind closed doors and now feel comfortable to talk about this and feel that it's a natural progression? Or do you think it's more a case of people are still in wait and see mode, that want to see how quickly the formal relationship goes, and then people will pick up speed?
Yeah, good question. And I think, I've been wondering about this too. I mean, I was surprised by some of the kind of enthusiasm that came out online in particular. But a few years ago, I made a speech where I talked about anti-Semitism in the Arab world to an Arab audience, and I had, been somewhat reticent about speaking about it because, there are sensitivities, the overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. And the response from the audience, which was a Muslim Arab audience, was actually we should be addressing this issue because anti-Semitism, separated from the political question of Israel, is actually something that affects our moral health, our ethical health. And so that's when I began to get an inkling that actually the relationship with Israel, the relationship with Judaism is actually much more nuanced than, say, the public rhetoric that we grew up with suggested. So I think that there will be some people who are waiting to see what happens next. I think also there's going to be a pace at which this relationship develops. And my experience of relationships is that there is initial euphoria, there's initial excitement. Both sides will have both stereotypes about the other, as well as fantasies about what can be achieved. And then, we'll all hit reality, which is, we all live in the same kind of societies, the same kind of, economic and cultural environments, and nobody's going to be taken for a fool. So I think that's the bit when it gets really interesting, when the hard work of actually connecting begins. And just a little earlier today, I spoke to an Israeli delegation that is in Dubai, and they came with one of the largest banks in Israel to sign a deal with, not a deal, a memorandum of understanding with one of the leading banks in the UAE. And they were very interested also in understanding what they could expect. Because again, there is this rush to say, oh, well, our technology, our education, our knowledge can marry your wealth funds and so on. And, that's a sort of a marriage made in heaven. But I think actually we'll find that, there's going to be a lot of caution and reticence in the long run. So we need to work at breaking that down.
I mean, so many issues to pick up with you from that, because you're right in terms of, these are going to be steps, and there'll be certain very natural areas of cooperation and others that will take time. So I guess what would be your message to young Israelis who have never come to the Gulf region, and of course will be now coming to the UAE? We've heard, of course, that Bahrain is also establishing ties with Israel. So what would your message be to young Israelis?
I think it'll be interesting for us to see how they look at us. I mean, for a certain sector of young Israelis, I think that they will also have some very clear stereotypes about what to expect from us. I mean, there are the typical Gulf stereotypes about wealth and about knowledge. And then there are the historical experience of peace with Jordan and Egypt, which were very cold. To be blunt, they were not particularly warm forms of peace, and there wasn't much people-to-people interaction. Now, I think what they'll find is that young Emiratis in particular are, sort of global in outlook, are excited about learning new things, love to travel, and love to experience new experiences. And that they should be ready for a large number of Emirati tourists turning up all across Israel. So I think they should as a diplomat, I've spent a lot of time in the last few years trying to differentiate between what we are and what sort of the broader Arab world is. And there are no kind of there's no single type of Arab that exists. We are so different in many ways. And that's what they should expect, that actually, they'll find that there's a tremendous amount of commonality in outlook and aspiration. And it's just going to be really fascinating going forward.
Now, of course, there is the issue of Palestine, the aspirations of young Palestinians also. Many Palestinians that yearn for the day they can have their own state, the continued occupation of Palestine. The UAE has been very clear in its continued support for a two-state solution and its call for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So I want to ask you, what do you say to young Palestinians who may be watching you, who, of course, heard from Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed himself, who spoke about the historic relationship with Palestinians that will continue. I want to ask you, what's your message to young Palestinians particularly?
Young Palestinians particularly, our loyalty to the Palestinian cause is no weaker today than it was over the last 48 years. We are deeply committed to a Palestinian statehood and to the Palestinian cause and to justice for the Palestinian people wherever they are. There is potentially, I suppose, there is a disconnect that we see between the Palestinian cause and, say, Palestinian leadership, which is factionalized and subject to many different constraints and pressures. Our peace with Israel will serve the Palestinian cause in ways that we cannot predict today. But there are ways in which I think it can directly, in that we, as a major economy and as a major player in the Middle East and with our relationships globally, we will be able to stand inside the tent of the Palestinian issue and actually make statements and put pressure where it concerns the Palestinians in the favor of the Palestinians. We have, I suppose, upended a logic that dominated Arab discourse for a long time, which was that the Gulf states are a sort of gift to give the Israelis after the establishment of the Palestinian state. Well, that approach, it basically takes away any agency from the Gulf states. And we basically are signaling that kind of approach is over. We are agents of our own fate. We will fight for our own interests. And we will, what looks like betrayal is actually another example of greater loyalty. We will better be able to serve the Palestinian cause by having the direct relationship, by having economic and commercial ties with the Israelis, than by standing outside the tent and waiting for, sort of history to take its course.
As you said, a lot has been appended by changing the dynamic, the discourse, the stagnation that had enveloped the Palestinian cause and the Arab-Israeli relationship. So, tomorrow there will be the signing of the first agreement in over a quarter of a century between Israel and an Arab nation. In this case, of course, it's the UAE. And so I wanted to ask you, how does this change the region?
Yeah, it's interesting because many people will say that we've signed this deal with the Israelis either for American defense equipment or to sort of ally against regional powers. or for purely economic reasons, or because we have no respect for Arab causes. All of that is incorrect. The UAE is a country that really looks. I've said this a number of times, and leadership has also emphasized this tremendously. We're a nation that focuses on the present and looks to the future. We're interested. Our government is deeply committed to thinking about problems and to solving them, not just at a local level, but at a global level. We would like ultimately to become a global player. Even though we're not one of the largest countries in the world, it is our ability to identify and to solve problems in a tough region that will allow us to play that global role. The leadership in the Palestinian, well, it's perhaps we go on to the next question. I've lost my train of thought there. There were so many trains.
There is so much to talk about because, as you said, it changes so much in the region, but at the same time, it tells us a lot about the UAE and the UAE's approach to looking at understanding the past, but looking towards the future and saying, how can we get out of, let's say, almost cul-de-sacs or corners that have been created and try to forge a different way. And so I guess my next question for you is that, what does that look like in terms of opportunities? If you can drill down into a bit more specific detail about the sorts of opportunities you hope will be created by this new relationship.
I think that some of the obvious ones are, so the logistics connection that we'll be able to form with Israel. And, there was a discussion this morning about specifically about the ports and the airports of Israel. And I think it's kind of amusing also, with a slight political kind of twist here. The Turks were very unhappy with our relationship with Israel. And yet, of course, the Turks have had a relationship with Israel since 1949. And I discovered recently that actually Israel is one of the major hubs for Turkish airlines flying to the Far East. And, the fact that there might be an economic argument that they would make against, the Turks, to make against the Emirates may have something to do with that situation. I think there's the technologies that we see coming out of Israel. They're world famous for having developed some of the most amazing technologies. I think we would like to get involved in the financing of some of those technologies, but also in technology transfer and educational transfer to the Emirates. And I believe the Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence just recently signed with the Weizmann Institute a cooperation on students and education and courses. So that's very exciting. I think that there are so many different ways in which we could potentially benefit. It would be interesting to see what an Israeli entrepreneur would do in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. How would they view the set of kind of issues and potential solutions that they might offer? And on the other hand, it might be interesting to see what Emirati entrepreneurs would do with opportunities in Israel as well. So I think it's a question of imagination and how far you want to go with it.
I want to go back to a point that you spoke about, which is the issue of anti-Semitism, the issue of identity. And also at the same time, for many Arabs, it's an issue of the Palestinian cause was a point to rally around, and we see so much fragmentation. That this was one of the almost last pinnacles of, at least on the surface, of agreement. Let's all agree on this issue. But there have been shifting sands now. And one of those is more and more people in this region who don't want to be defined in the public sphere by religion, rather that this is a private matter and it's their identity private. So I want to talk to you about that, like how this changes some of identity politics in the region, but also importantly for people, how they identify. And the UAE has really pushed this agenda of tolerance and spoken about, we've discussed the term necessarily tolerance is not always understood in the same way in English as it is in Arabic, tasamuh, but this idea of living together and peaceful coexistence. Tell me about the UAE's vision for that and how the Abraham Accords fit into that thinking and that approach that has been going on for years now.
Just on the subject of tolerance, I actually think that that is already a high enough standard. I know that some people who object to the word tolerance, want to have a much friendlier world. But I actually, my opinion of fellow human beings is not astoundingly high. I think tolerance is already a superb achievement. If we can get that far, then we will have gone a long way. Sort of more broadly, the effect that it's going to have on our sense of identity is that, well, I think it's actually a reflection that our identities are much more complex than I'm an Arab, therefore I have to do X, Y, Z, and I'm a Muslim, therefore these are my 3 or 4 key beliefs. I think we are just going to find perhaps that discourse becomes much more interesting and complex. We're going to discover that Arabs don't actually have to agree. I mean, there is this kind of almost a religious edict that says all Arabs must agree on everything. And in fact, it would be wonderful if we could agree to disagree and sort of move on from there. And I think we are actually coming to that stage. Once we have a clearer sense of sovereignty and personal kind of autonomy, it then becomes easier to say, okay, well, I have done this. This is what I believe. This is what we believe is right for us. You, in turn, may find that you believe other things, and we will respect that. As long as it doesn't affect our existential safety. I think that's where we're heading, to be honest. And it'll also be interesting as time goes by. I mean, the Bahrainis have now said that they will sign an agreement. There are rumors that other Arab countries are going to be doing that. It'll be interesting to look at why each country has made that decision and what it is that each of those countries would expect to change both internally and some more broadly regionally.
Now, we're also looking towards the opening of the Abrahamic House here in the UAE. Of course, we had the monumental visit of the Pope to the UAE last year, and there's been a lot of talk about the importance of what unites the children of Abrahamic faith is actually much more than what divides them. So tell me a bit more about the UAE's approach to that and the importance of the Abrahamic House.
Yeah, this is where I think our leadership has been extraordinarily creative, imaginative, and courageous. Because already when we announced the Abrahamic Family House, I personally was overwhelmed with emotion and overjoyed with the idea that we would have 3 houses of worship, a mosque, a church, and a synagogue. And to be honest, I mean, people like me thought that that was already such a great achievement. That was already such a great statement. Very difficult to have imagined that there would be another step where we'd actually, reach out to the Israelis to sign a peace accord with them. Now, it's interesting also that if we can remove that, possibly the largest taboo in the Arab mind, then pretty much everything is possible and everything is up for discussion, I'd say. And that, again, is something very exciting. It links in with the idea of tolerance that has been adopted and promoted by the Emirates leadership for the last few years, with the naming of the Ministry of Tolerance and then the Year of Tolerance. And it's exciting to see how, you take this label of tolerance and then you begin to express it with the Abrahamic Family House, with the outreach to Israel. And I'm going to be, sort of fascinated to see what comes next as a result of these very brave decisions.
Part of what comes next is, as you said, this is a people-to-people kind of relationship that's being built. So cultural diplomacy is something you've been incredibly involved in. Tell me what your thoughts are in terms of cultural diplomacy with Israel, but also where this places the UAE globally in terms of cultural diplomacy.
Well, for some time now, I mean, you know that we've got art fairs in the Emirates, and we have a sort of a large and active cultural sector, galleries all over the country, and it's kind of been a secret for some time, but a number of those galleries have actually done very well by selling Arab and Middle Eastern art to big Israeli collectors. So that is something that now may come out into the open. I think there will be a great deal of interest. Purely on the cultural level, for Israelis to come and see what it is that we've been doing, how it is that we express ourselves, what are our concerns, and how they can participate. I think there'll be a lot of that. I think also, I mean, we're now speaking to the department within the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so their public diplomacy department, And we're looking at sort of academic exchanges and sort of youth exchanges, trips back and forth. Of course, we need to make sure that COVID is out of the way first. But there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. And from my perspective, within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm just wondering whether we'll be able to play any role in this, because kids are already so excited about it. There's interest, I think, on both sides in terms of language. I know certainly a number of Emiratis have either demonstrated proficiency in Hebrew or are looking to study Hebrew and to discover more about the way in which Israelis look at the world and think about the world. And I think, just at a kind of a fundamental level, Israel being this kind of mythical tech state in our neighborhood in the Middle East, having taken, sort of having developed technologies in agriculture and further, it's interesting to see how there'll be sort of cross-pollination with our tech entrepreneurs as well in the Emirates and in the broader Gulf.
And I think one of the issues that for many Palestinians that doesn't come out as much is that this doesn't happen to exclude the Palestinians. This just means, as you said, that the tent is wider, because for many Palestinians, they found the UAE as a home, cultural diplomacy, but also in business have really been able to thrive here. So I guess I want to come back to the point that, it doesn't mean that one side has to exclude the other.
Sure.
And how do you approach that? Like, how do you make sure that message is there, that of course, we're all talking about the UAE-Israeli relationship because that's the new one. So it's natural that's the old potential. In addition to, as you said, Israel has these many sectors that the UAE is interested in. So if we can, how do you?
That's actually a very important question, because in the way I talk about the relationship and in the way certain other representatives of the Emirates talk about the relationship, our focus is really on the relationship with Israel. And there is, not as much reference to Palestine or the Palestinians as one might hope or expect. And the reason is, yes, it's because, it's the relationship with Israel that is the new element here. And it's the dynamics between the Emiratis and the Israelis that is going to be interesting. But I think also we need to bear in mind that there are almost 2 million Israeli citizens who are actually Palestinian, and they form a part of Israel. And I am absolutely positive that the Emirates, in its relationship with Israel, will be very interested in interacting with the Palestinian Israelis as well, to find out what has their experience been. How do they stand on the question of peace? How do they see, the question of Judaism and Israel? So the Palestinian, in our view, the Palestinian question is not represented solely by, the Palestinian Authority or by Hamas in Gaza. There are many Palestinian voices that need to be heard by not just by the Emiratis, but by the rest of the Arab world. So in that sense, that will come with time, once we have an embassy, once we have a presence there, and once we have Palestinian Israelis coming to the UAE as well. So it's going to be a really fascinating and exciting time to find out what's really going on in Israel.
So I want to talk about the actual ceremony, the signing ceremony tomorrow. A lot of us are curious as to what it will be like. So I want to ask you first, not so much as Your Excellency going there as an official, but as you, Amar, who have always spoken very candidly, what does it mean to you to go and attend this ceremony and actually witness a historic moment like that?
Right. Well, there is a bit of humor here. Of course, the ceremonies at the White House have been famous for being no mask ceremonies, and so, I'm planning to bring extra masks for anybody who needs them. So, we're going to be all covered up. That's number one. Number two is that, it's almost surreal, to be honest. A few days ago, I was in the Emirates, and then all of a sudden I get a message saying, pack your bags, you're going to DC. So for me personally, it's a massive honor, and I'm so excited to get the opportunity to actually be there. We have our Bahraini colleagues who will also be there, so there may be a bit of crowding on the stage. And I've got extra pens just in case we run out of ink for the signing. So just to make sure.
I knew there was a good reason you were there. So I want to ask you about diplomacy, because unfortunately we've seen too many times when diplomacy hasn't succeeded in the region. But this is a diplomatic moment. It's a moment where you can have triumph and you can actually, as you said, disagree on certain political issues, but then still see reasons to build bridges with another country. Tell me what you think this means for UAE diplomacy.
I think it's a major step forward for UAE diplomacy. I've been in and out of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 1993, and I've seen the evolution of our sense of self, our sense of sovereignty, our sense of agency, and it's really, really got it's an 180-degree turn. And this is a moment of, for me, real national pride. Pride, not necessarily in signing a deal with the Israelis, but pride that we take steps to ensure our interests are served. And that allows us to then be a more powerful state, a more stable state, a more kind of a solid state that allows us then to look at others. So in a way, so I was going to say the method, the saying that charity begins at home. Essentially, it does strengthen ourselves. Then we can go out and help our friends, and that's something that our young diplomats will need to take into account and to understand that the state is moving at a certain rate. Our diplomats need to also move at that rate, or if not faster, in being able to explain, being able to verbalize, being able to defend the actions of our state. And do so with conviction and pride.
So that point about young diplomats, you also wrote a wonderful book called Letters to a Young Muslim. And I wanted to ask you that because you said you wrote that because you were actually addressing it to your son. You want to talk about how the future could be. And that comes in line with what you're saying about young Emirati diplomats, where their present and their future will be markedly different from that of the past 20, 30, 40 decades. So tell me more about that journey of writing about, addressing young Muslims, and also how this tees up with the Abraham Accords, but also with the UAE's visionary future thinking.
Sounds like I'm going to have to write a PhD for you, Amina.
Well, you've got about 5 minutes to do it.
Yeah, it actually seems like a lifetime ago because I wrote the book and published it in 2017. So, sort of at the peak of ISIS domination of sort of public media and territory in Syria and Iraq, and I was really at a loss there. I really thought that this was such an awful and tragic and miserable way for the Arab world to develop, or the Muslim world to develop, and it seems like such a lifetime away. But nevertheless, I mean, the key messages that I had in that book for young people was to really to trust themselves, to trust yourself as a young person, to know that you can tell the difference between right and wrong, and that there are older people who are out to instrumentalize you, to use your existence to further their goals. And I always wanted to see at least the Emirates, if not the wider region, as a nation of individuals who believe strongly in their country, but also believe strongly in their personal autonomy, their ability to make decisions, their ability to craft their own life, and I think to design their own life. And I think that's where our society is actually going, and the state is kind of exemplifying that. There are so many ways in which what the Emirates has done, going back to 2006, has been to say, look, this is what our traditional interests look like, but we're going to go off in this direction as well, because we need to know that we can do many things, not just one thing. And 2006 is, I believe, the year that the renewable energy program was started, which went completely against the hydrocarbon logic of our economy. And the Pope's visit was, again, it goes completely against the taboo of foreign religions, other religions on the Arabian Peninsula, and as well, so the Abrahamic family house. So there are so many things that our government and our leadership has done to break those mental kind of structures. I think young people should see this as an opportunity also to the traditional saying of thinking outside the box. Go ahead, because the box is being broken. It's being redesigned completely. And it is, I would be, it's an exciting time to be a young person in the Emirates.
And part of that redesign will be on display in full force with Expo next year.
Yeah.
Now, we are so used to saying Expo 2020, and I guess it still is Expo 2020 because we're all going to pretend this year didn't happen. I'm going to be a year younger next year. And so as we look towards 2020, but Expo really is going to be, I mean, the pillars of Expo, talking about mobility, sustainability, and opportunity, those three pillars for where the UAE stands. And again, I'd like to hear from you how that vision for Expo, but also, we knew that the UAE invited all countries, all UN member states to Expo, and that included Israel, and that was from last year. And it was one of those things that, again, was reported. There wasn't this sort of, immediate backlash of, why is this happening? Because it was, as you said, as the UAE is a global power and a global player, then you can't have an international event and decide to exclude even other countries that you may not get on, not only Israel get home with. So I want to ask you about Expo next year. As we look towards Expo, we have Abrahamic Accords here, but also, as you said, that redesign. How will that come into play next year?
I think now, I mean, it's given what happened with the postponement of Expo and COVID and all of the different kind of the realignment of government to focus on economic development and small and medium-sized businesses, on even greater connectivity, in terms of food security, in terms of medical and health security. It's just amazing to be able to see that. And what our government is doing is I think the expression is to turn on a dime. The idea that you can change direction as soon as you spot a structural shift. It's not a massive kind of ship or a container ship that you need to take time to turn around. We turn around in the course of a few weeks. And that's what's very exciting to see. The way in which we went from broadly political Arab issues to focusing immediately on those elements that we need to strengthen ourselves on. So again, food security, water security, and health. I think that the Expo 2020 will be a reflection of a changing set of interests, and I think we'd love to see our fellow Arab states begin to think in that way as well, because it's going to improve the state of the common Arab, and it's going to improve the state of the Arab world. You have to break a taboo perhaps to see what's possible, and I hope that what we have done and what we're doing will play out in that way, that it will actually be seen as a controversial step, but a very positive step as well. And not one built out or constructed out of selfishness. Self-interest is different from selfishness. We're not turning our back on the Arab world. We're not turning our back on the Muslim world. In fact, what we're doing is we're strengthening our position to serve those causes even more.
It's interesting what you're saying, the difference between selfishness and self-interest, and also setting aside slogans, because I think too much of our immediate past, but also our future, could be found in empty slogans that, unfortunately, the Palestinians have been the first victims of.
Yeah.
Only those who declared that they were defending Palestine or defending the Arab cause actually did. We'd be in a different world.
Yeah.
So that takes me to the point about the UAE's approach to policy making, but also to its relationships with others. That kind of very open but clear and transparent approach when it comes to themes. So whether it's public health and the interest of the UAE in public health in Africa, for example, is something that I think many people don't know about. Likewise, agriculture and the interest with those sectors. So how does the Abraham Accord and the peace agreement with Israel help to serve that wider agenda that the UAE has been pushing?
One of the sort of sentences that I came across in the last few hours about, so within our own internal documentation, was about the Abrahamic Accord, is that we would hope to work with Israel on bringing some of these benefits, these potential benefits, to the rest of the Arab world. This is not purely for the benefit of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Al Khaimah, the UAE. The primary focus would be to pull in benefit for ourselves, but it is then the spirit of the UAE and the spirit of leadership in the UAE to take those benefits and to share them as much as possible. And I think you can see that from the almost daily announcements of the Emirati donations to other countries for COVID. There's a huge amount of aid going out to different countries, almost kind of without distinguishing between friend and foe. So there is the instinct to give, but in order to give, we have to build ourselves even more, and that's what I see that our government and our leadership and even our business community are interested in. We're gonna connect. We're gonna connect as well as we can, and we have the leadership to do it.
So we're unbelievably running out of time. I thought I'd have much more time to ask you even more questions, but I have two final questions before we wrap up. And my first is, tomorrow, as an editor, I have to come up with a headline coming out from the signing. So I'm going to ask you to help me write the headline. What is the headline to take away from tomorrow's important signing?
I really believe it's a new era. It's a new era for Emiratis. In one way or another, it's a new era for the Gulf states, because we are so similar in outlook, because we are so similar in the kinds of economic and social structures. I'm not saying that anybody else is going to sign peace, but there is what we are doing is a reflection of where we all are. So a new era. And not necessarily an era that's going to be particularly easy. It opens up opportunities for a lot of work and a lot of hard work. But the sense of opportunity is there, both at the political level and at the sort of the lifestyle, technological, commercial level as well. One leading American said that this was just a distraction from President Trump's troubles. It's a bit sad to hear that, because it's genuinely a historic change in the structure of the Middle East, and that's why we should be so proud of what we're doing.
Thank you. Okay, and then my final question to you is even though we still have 3 more months before the year 2020 is over, and we don't know what it may throw at us, I want to ask you how you'll remember the year 2020 and how UAE diplomats will really look back towards 2020 and see what the country has done, especially since our main, let's say, umbrella slogan for this year was, this is the year to prepare for the 50th, when the UAE celebrates its 50th anniversary since, it was a modern nation as the UAE. So how will you remember 2020, and how do we prepare for the 50th anniversary?
Well, 2020 was a funny year because all of a sudden, office space didn't make sense anymore. So when we were all told to go back to the office after having spent a few months away from them, it really made us wonder what we were all actually doing there, given that we could communicate online. But sort of physical presence is symbolic, and it's important, and so there will always be some room for that. But it did show that we can communicate very, very much more effectively online than we do when we're sort of walking around office buildings. So that at kind of a mundane level, I think, is exceptionally interesting and important. What else will it be? Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs really got together to pull together, sort of international cooperation under Her Excellency Reem Al-Hashmi's leadership, a tremendous amount of connectivity with countries that need assistance, and that really built a lot of friendships that weren't necessarily there in the past. Clarified also for us who stood with us and who was, a little more reticent, so that again, times of crisis clarifies relationships. That was important. Young diplomats. I mean, over the summer there was a lot of questioning about, well, with COVID, is there any role for diplomacy? And actually, it turns out the role of diplomacy is there. It's shifted to a different format. It's no longer necessarily just taking care of the local events. It's communicating with people, explaining, and trying to sort of increase the significance of the Emirates for different groups. So I think young diplomats have been shaken, but as they say, not stirred. I think that counts as a dad joke, I believe. They're going to go back. They're going to go back to work, and they're going to have so much more to do. The realignment from political issues towards issues around food and health are going to have an effect on the way in which our diplomacy is also conducted.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Perfectly timed answer. We have come to a close of this conversation. I really appreciate your candid responses, Your Excellency. Safe travels. Wear your mask.
Thank you very much.
And inshallah, we'll see you back in Abu Dhabi. Many thanks.
Thank you. Inshallah. Thank you so much.